Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Veronica Kitchen on anti-terrorism. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, the CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And every week, I'm happy to welcome a guest into the studios here at the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario, to talk about some important topical issue in global governance. And today, my guest is my colleague, Veronica Kitchen, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and a notable scholar of various dimensions of security, global security, regional security, NATO, and currently working on a couple of projects related to terrorism and anti-terrorism. So welcome.
Thank you very much.
Nice to have you with us. Let's start by asking the obvious question. We've had trouble defining terrorism. The world as a whole has failed on numerous occasions to actually come together on a single definition of terrorism. So how tricky then is it to define anti-terrorism?
I would argue probably less difficult than you would think. So one way that we've gotten around the tricky issue of defining terrorism is by thinking of terrorism as a tactic. So any kind of a tactic that targets civilians can be thought of as terrorism. Some people add to that with the goal of affecting political change, but that then gets into the murky area of motives, which is, I think, what makes terrorism so difficult to define. But if we're thinking about how we respond to terrorism, we can think of counterterrorism and anti-terrorism. And a lot of people will define counterterrorism as anything offensive against the kinds of tactics that are used, usually by non-state actors, to target civilians, usually with a political motive. And then we can think of anti-terrorism as the defensive side. What are we doing at home in order to try to prevent terrorism, mitigate the effects of terrorism, and respond to terrorist attacks? So if we sort of leave out motives and think about it in terms of policies, then it becomes a bit easier to define. It gets a little bit murky making that distinction between the home game and the away game, because as with many topics in international relations, the two spheres don't bisect perfectly into the things that are international and the things that are domestic. It's further made murky, I think, by the fact that the most predominant way of thinking about anti-terrorism, so the set of issues related to domestic responses to terrorism, is the all hazards approach, by which we mean that the way you respond to a natural disaster or to a terrorist attack is at its core the same. At the margins, there are some different issues related to how you gather evidence, but at the core, responding to a terrorist attack and responding to, say, a hurricane in terms of first responders, emergency preparedness, mitigation, all of those things look quite a lot the same. So while we can make this home-away distinction, we shouldn't get too wrapped up in the home-away distinction. And my focus, in fact, is on studying responses, domestic responses to terrorism, but also looking at how those domestic responses have become transnationalized. So how states are cooperating with each other, and not just states, but also provinces, states in the United States, territories, cities, with their counterparts across national borders in order to respond to domestic issues.
So is it fair to say that anti-terrorism policy kicks in after a terrorist attack has happened?
Not entirely. So prevention, you could think of prevention, things like de-radicalization as part of anti-terrorism. But we also think of prevention in terms of stopping someone with malicious intent from getting too close to a building. You could that would definitely be anti-terrorism and would fall into the category of prevention. Mitigation. So if you're worried about your water supply being poisoned or a building being blown up, the measures that you can take to ensure that disaster doesn't spread any further than the immediate site of the attack. And then response to an attack that has happened would also fall into the category of anti-terrorism. That's probably where most people think of the bulk of it. So first response, emergency planning, so that you know how to respond to that kind of an attack.
Mm-hmm. And are there any circumstances where the anti-terrorism and counterterrorism are of a piece? In other words, you can't do one without also doing the other. It just won't work.
I really think that in the realm of prevention, that's true. De-radicalization at home sort of goes hand in hand with issues like working with diaspora communities, thinking about links between communities in different countries, thinking about, for instance, people who would go abroad to learn terrorist techniques and then come back. So in that field of prevention, I think they work particularly well together. They're never completely separate, and you've got many of the same institutions working on them. So for instance, an international strategy to counter terrorism is likely to have the same kinds of institutional homes as a domestic strategy to prevent terrorism. But they are in many ways separable, I think, although not entirely separate.
Mm-hmm. And what's the distinction between, say, anti-terrorism and regular everyday police work, right? The kinds of jobs that we pay the cops to do on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Is there something distinctive about the anti-terrorist piece or not?
That's actually sort of one of the things that we're interested in. One of the things that we've been studying is the way in which day-to-day policing has come to take on more and more tasks that we think of as security-related tasks. And we'll talk, I think, later about what the implications of that shift are for society. But it's fairly clear that we are asking our police to do more and more tasks related to security, where previously they were just responding. Well, it's not fair to say that they were never responding to crime. But we can now talk about national security policing. We've been able to talk about national security policing for a while. So I think what we're seeing, rather than seeing a distinction, we're seeing actors shifting into taking on more and more roles in new domains.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, we'll be back to pursue this with Veronica Kitchen. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Veronica, let's talk a little bit about trends. Now, I would assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of the focus on both counterterrorism and anti-terrorism has been as a result of 9/11 and what's happened afterwards. So one interpretation of the world was that anti-terrorism and counterterrorism were bumping along at a fairly low level, and all of a sudden they became very elevated, and certainly in the United States policy hierarchy, but many other countries as well.
Yeah.
So the first question is that accurate? Is that a gross oversimplification? But within that range of developments, what trends do we see? What sort of directions do we see anti-terrorism policy taking globally? Yeah,
I think it is largely accurate to say that there was a great increase in attention to anti-terrorism and counterterrorism after September 11th, particularly in North America, where we had dealt only in fairly isolated instances with terrorism on domestic soil prior to September 11th. So in Europe, there were countries that had a stronger legacy. In North America, if you look sort of pre to post September 11th, you do see a massive growth in institutions. And I would call that a trend. One of the things that was identified in the 9/11 report as having been a problem that helped to create the conditions where terrorists were able to attack the United States was the lack of information sharing and the fact that there were silos of information that didn't get shared, so that nobody was able to connect the dots sufficiently quickly. And in response to that, we saw the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. In Canada, the creation and the reorganization of the government to create the Department of Public Safety. And we've seen that elsewhere as well. But we've also seen, another trend I would say is integration. We've seen a trend to building institutions where you can bring together police, military, emergency planners, and intelligence functions, both on the information sharing side and then also on the operational side. So a really nice example of this that'll be familiar to a lot of Canadians are the integrated security forces that were used both at the Olympics and at the G20 in order to respond to any potential security threats. So, for instance, but that's been a generalized approach as well, not just for special events. So in Canada, for instance, we saw the creation of the Integrated National Security Enforcement Teams within the RCMP, which combine RCMP officers with representatives from Canadian forces, other parts of the federal and provincial government, and in some cases even local police in various cities across Canada. And it's not that there was no precedent for those, but it was a new institution after September 11th. We saw the same thing in the United States with the creation of the fusion centers in an attempt to start to bring pieces of information from different parts of the government together. So that's sort of on the information sharing side. On the operational side, the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Forces, which already existed before September 11th, just the number of them increased exponentially. And in the United Kingdom, which is the third country I've been studying, they created new counterterrorism units with sort of the same integrative model and purpose. I already talked about the all hazards approach as another trend. That we can date back to September 11th, but in the United States, it also dates back to Hurricane Katrina, and the sense that the reorganization of the Department of Homeland Security and the incorporation of FEMA into the Department of Homeland Security didn't ultimately serve Americans well during Hurricane Katrina. And so there's some questioning of the all hazards approach, but I think the general conclusion was we need to do the all hazards approach better. And I would certainly identify that as still a major trend, not the exclusive model of approaching counterterrorism and anti-terrorism, but still a significant trend.
Now, one of the obvious differences between the pre-9/11 and the post-9/11 era is that pre-9/11 there actually were terrorist attacks in North America.
Yeah.
And since 9/11 there have been none.
Yep.
No successful ones anyway.
Yep.
So one interpretation is that the institutions are working beautifully. The other interpretation is that there aren't any threats. Or that we overestimated them and we've overreacted institutionally. How do we decide between those two interpretations, given that, although our political leaders tell us that they have successfully thwarted terrorist plots, they're never specific. They don't say how many, where, what kind, involving who. Total hush-hush.
Yeah. The first thing is I think it's fairly safe to say that the threat to terrorism is minuscule compared to many of the other threats, both in the realm of security and in the realm of just public safety that we might conceivably face. And the question of whether our institutions are working, I'm not sure that an outside researcher like you or I are ever going to be able to get a really good handle on the number of terrorist attacks that were attempted and the number that were thwarted, not just because they're unlikely to tell us, but because that sort of information is really hard to measure. It's really hard to know what counts as a thwarted terrorist attack. But what I think is interesting is that now, 10 years down the road, we're finally starting to look back critically on all of the developments of the past 10 years and thinking about whether they served us well societally and whether they served us well in terms of maintaining our security. And for a long time, that was difficult to do because the memories of September 11th were too close, for one thing, and so it was easy to be labeled as an anti-patriot for doing that kind of thing, but also because the institutions were too new. I think on some level it's not fair to evaluate an institution that's brand new because you don't have a sense yet of nobody knows their job yet. You don't have a sense yet of if it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, much less whether what it was supposed to be doing is the right thing.
Right. And of course you can't tell how high you can jump in the high jump until you at some point knock the bar off. So in other words, you don't know until you've failed in anti-terrorism how well you're doing anti-terrorism.
Yeah. And that sort of creates a really difficult paradox because you don't have solid measures of success most of the time. There's a discourse of fear that surrounds the threat, which, as I said, it's fairly safe to say that it's not as high as we in the public probably perceive that it is based on the kind of media attention it gets and the kind of government attention it gets. But at the same time, many of the measures that we take will be useful. Many of them will not be useful. Many of them will be pork barreling. Many of them will be security theater. And so those are the kinds of things that now with 10 years of experience, we can probably look back and start to ask difficult questions about what was a good idea and what was a bad idea. John Mueller, for instance, has a new book out where he starts to do that in the United States.
Your project is a timely one. So.
I hope so.
We'll be back again with Veronica Kitchen. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Veronica, let me probe you a little bit more about the societal issues you were raising in the earlier segment, which I personally find fascinating. So you're right that in the grand scheme of things, transnational terrorism is a minuscule threat if you just look at the operational tempo of groups like Al-Qaeda and the actual damage and deaths they manage to cause. They're frankly not all that big a deal. But some people do say that the one way the terrorists can win is that they can make us change. They can turn us into people that we don't really want to be. What's your take on the state of the world 10 years after 9/11?
I think that we do devote probably more time and energy to worrying about and thinking about terrorism than is necessary. That's not to say that we should dismantle all of the things that we have done. Many of them make us safer. Locks on the cockpit doors. There isn't really a good reason for those not to be there. Contrasting that with the fact that in some airports it's still common to make all of the passengers go through large numbers of security measures, but cargo and employees don't go through nearly the same number of security measures. I mean, those are sort of two different situations. I think that what we have seen is what is generally referred to in the literature as a process of securitization. And so we're seeing more and more issues, more and more spaces, more and more institutions that view the world through the lens of security. And that's not always societally good, because those of us, and I include scholars of security in this group, who view the world through the lens of security tend to look for solutions that look like security. And that's not always the best thing for society, because it can lead to these ever-escalating measures. Haggerty and Boyle at the University of Alberta refer to it as spectacularization. We have a tendency to spectacularization because you've got this paradox that on the one hand, security works best when it's invisible. On the other hand, people need to know that they're being secured, so there's the tendency to make it visible. And then there's also the paradox that the threat is fairly minuscule, but the consequences could really be quite devastating, as we saw with September 11th. And we don't really have a good way of wrapping our brains around these two paradoxes. And so it makes the task of doing security ethically that much more difficult. And if you combine that with the effects of the fact that security is bureaucratized. As I said, one of the trends has been the proliferation of institutions, which of course also means the proliferation of bureaucracies. And we know that one of the risks associated with modern bureaucracies is that ethics can get a little bit lost. Each of us is responsible for one step in the chain, but not the whole picture. And so even if you're confident that your chunk of the big picture is ethical, it doesn't necessarily mean that the whole picture is ethical. And so we can get securitization, so this idea that more and more spaces and routines are viewed through the lens of security. We can get that kind of securitization out of the routines of bureaucracy. Everybody's just doing their piece of the job with no malicious intent, but the effect is that the whole can have a malicious intent. So in fact, a good example of this is something that one of our PhD students in the Global Governance program is studying. Reese McCold is looking at the concept of best practices in homeland security and public safety. And his argument is that very often these best practices get borrowed from one country to the next, but they don't actually refer to anything concrete back at the beginning. They've just been designated as best practices because they've been borrowed, and not necessarily because they've been systematically shown to actually be the best practice. So that could be an example of where you see, through no malicious intent and through, in fact, everybody's best intentions, nonetheless, the proliferation of more and more securitized spaces.
So what would be an example of Canada borrowing a kind of best practice, let's say from the United States in the post 9/11 era? We haven't set up offshore interrogation centers or done renditions or waterboarded people. So I assume we don't do that. But,
Hope so.
But there has been some change
Yeah.
in the legal landscape, in the policing practices in Canada. What have we borrowed, and are these, in your view, justified given the nature of the threats that Canada is facing, individually or as part of a larger community of liberal democracies?
So one good example of something they've borrowed, where I actually think that Canada took the right approach to borrowing, is the no-fly list. So the United States has this set of no-fly lists, in fact, that are very hard to get off of. It's hard to find out why you're on the no-fly list. It's hard to find out for sure if you're on the no-fly list. Canada, under pressure from the United States, instituted its own no-fly list called Passenger Protect. Pressure from the United States was not the only reason to adopt it. Canada had its own reasons to want to adopt that list. But it tried, probably not entirely successfully, but at least it tried to make sure that when it adopted the list, that there were provisions for getting off the list, for instance. If you thought that you had been added to the list in error, or provisions for if you're one of those people who has a common name and there's somebody on the list with your name on it. So that's an example of a measure that was borrowed with probably the right intent. Now, there are some problems with the Passenger Protect program itself. For instance, it's, one argument that's often made is if these people are so dangerous that they shouldn't be flying, should they be really walking around on the street in the first place? So whether the type of person who's on the no-fly list really needs to be on the no-fly list is maybe a good question.
But from an anti-terrorism perspective, Canada is in a sense a little less constrained than the Americans because they have this deeper, more robust history of individual rights and a constitution that protects them more enthusiastically than ours does.
Yeah.
So how has that played out? Have we stepped down any kind of slippery slope, or are we doing a good job of making sure that we balance individual rights against the needs of public safety?
I think balancing is the wrong question to ask. I used to think that we should talk about a balance between public safety and personal rights. But a few things I've read recently have convinced me that that's not the right way to think of it. And I think that the right way to think of it is more that individual rights are a collective good. And so privacy, for instance, is a collective good. It doesn't adhere to the individual. So we often think of the trade-off. People often make the argument that I have nothing to hide. I don't need to protect my privacy. Canadian law doesn't need to protect my privacy. But if we can think of things like privacy and civil rights as a collective good, then it becomes much more important to protect those things. Also, scholars are now arguing, people like Mark Neocleous and Colleen Bell are arguing that security is in fact a technique of liberal governance. And they both trace the history of security and liberalism back together and show that in fact the way that liberal societies govern is through designating certain things as good and certain things as bad, and creating categories of inclusion and exclusion. I'm grossly oversimplifying, but just to say that there's other ways of thinking about this problem than just as the dichotomy of rights versus security.
That's a very interesting take.
Yeah, and in terms of how well Canada is doing, I think it could be doing better. I mean, we did make massive changes to our legal framework after September 11th, probably more than were necessary. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not intimately familiar with the legal scholarship surrounding. I'm trying to think of an example.
Well, at least we had sunset clauses in some of
we
our
did have
provisions.
we did have sunset clauses.
Periodic parliamentary review. So there are some safeguards built in.
There are absolutely safeguards. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, good. We'll be back one more time with Veronica Kitchen. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So let me ask you a big question. Is anti-terrorism a subject of global governance? Do we have global governance for anti-terrorist policy or not?
That is a good question. And of course, it depends on what we think global governance is, but this is maybe not the right forum to
let's say it's the
try to answer that question.
The collective management and regulation of a problem by...
I think that we certainly have transnationalism in security governance. So we have examples like, and I think they're fascinating examples, like the NYPD, which sends liaison officers to other police departments, which is qualitatively different to me. A municipal police force sending police officers to other municipal police forces feels qualitatively different than, say, the FBI.
In other countries.
In other countries.
Yeah.
Than the FBI, which is a federal body sending liaisons to embassies in other countries, which fits much more with the interstate model of diplomacy that we're very accustomed to. So this model of exchanging representatives transnationally between different levels of government, I think is one example of security governance. We're also seeing as cities become involved in emergency planning, anti-terrorism planning, because cities, of course, are the first responders, this is often happening transnationally. So border cities frequently get together to practice responses. In the Pacific Northwest, for instance, where everybody expects an earthquake, the Canadian provinces and the American states cooperate together to practice and do tabletop exercises to think about how they would respond to a disaster like an earthquake. I think it's mostly fragmented, though. In Europe, within the European framework, there's regional governance of security under the Justice and Home Affairs chunk of issues. In North America, we have the new Security and Prosperity Partnership, that's the old one, the Beyond the Border initiative that was just signed, which is basically a work plan. It doesn't come up with a lot of conclusions, but it's got a lot of concrete policies, but it's got a lot of plans for policies that will govern security in the North American space, mostly at the federal level, between two federal governments. But as I say, there's actually lots of transnational linkages below. So I do think that we see pockets of global governance in security, and I'm finding more and more of them the more research I do, and I actually think that that's probably the most interesting part of the research, because it's taking the set of issues that is at once hyper-local but also hyper-global, and thinking about how you respond to that kind of a complex policy
and yet
problem.
the real battle against, for example, Al-Qaeda isn't taking place in North America as far as we can tell. The real battle is taking place in the Near East and the Middle East and in Yemen and in North Africa.
Yeah.
So to what extent is security governance reaching into those areas? One wouldn't naturally think of easy transnational, let alone interstate, or easy interstate, let alone transnational cooperation between, say, this Yemen and the United States, even though they might have a common enemy to some extent in Al-Qaeda.
So what you do see are the sharing of things like best practices. And as I say, one of our students, Reese McCold, is looking at how the idea of best practice itself might be a bit illusory, but we see, for instance, the Western countries sending trainers to help train police forces in other countries. Or vice versa. I mean, Israel, of course, has been dealing with this problem of domestic anti-terrorism for much longer and much more intensely than any of the other Western democracies. And a lot of countries have tried to learn from Israel. So my particular research project looks at transnationalism between, as I say, Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. But the phenomena exists elsewhere, this phenomena of integrated institutions being developed in response to a terrorist threat. And that's sort of the next logical avenue for research, is to see how well it extends.
Well, very good. Well, good luck with the current project.
Thank you.
We look forward to seeing what comes of it at the end of the pipeline, and hope to have you back. And
Absolutely.
To our audience, thank you for joining us once again for another episode of Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us online at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. And also check out our audio and video podcasts on iTunes.